welcome into the round table. Bill Priestley here with you, and we're talking about U.S.-China relations, especially as it relates to shipping and the relationship, of course, between the two. And joining us, we've got J.P. Hampstead, our strategic analyst here at FreightWaves, and then also joining us via satellite, if you will, Sal Mercogliano, found at Buies Creek, North Carolina, associate professor of history, as well as a former merchant marine as well, and a host of one of the best YouTube channels out there, if you get a chance to check him out there as well. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us here. JP, let me start with you. I think this is kind of like a little bit like LA Long Beach in the fact that people are kind of moving away from it a little bit in terms of U.S.-China, and that maybe things are starting to move away from that, away from manufacturers perhaps in that area. Do you feel like in this situation we're building to something that we might see in the near future?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think that the pendulum is still swinging sort of away from where it was maybe in 2000 or the late 90s when everyone was super optimistic about China. I mean, if you remember, the campaign finance scandal of 1996, right, when the Chinese government was using their embassy in Washington to funnel money into the DNC via the Commerce Department. Like there was a time when interests were extremely well aligned. This was how President Clinton was planning on getting reelected, becoming the most favored trade partner. And everything that happened after that, we've seen since. In the article, I wanted to make it clear that this isn't just something that has recently popped up about Taiwan. That this new view of China as a strategic competitor has been building for a decade now, at least. And whether we should expect some kind of climax or quick resolution, I'm not sure. We may be looking more into the way I phrased it was that. The Trans-Pacific has been easy, boring, and cheap for a while, and it's about to get exciting, difficult, and expensive, and it may stay that way. And even though rates have come down, I think volatility may be just the watchword of the day. There will be things that keep happening to drive congestion, to drive volatility, to drive unpredictability. I think President Xi's third term is kind of a signal that the country will be more autocratic, perhaps less predictable, and that central leadership in China will have less of a firm grasp of things on the ground. And so it's really hard to know what direction they will go in.
Sal, let me throw it to you. I know we could write a book on this, but do you feel like we're building to something and some massive change between U.S.-China relations as these things, this situation continues to modulate? You've got Taiwan, you've got zero tolerance policies. Where do you think we're headed here?
Waves where he talks about this specifically. Ever since the end of the Cold War, where you had a hyperpower like the United States, which really ensured free trade on the world's oceans, that's now in contention. As JP said, we're seeing a big difference out there. We're seeing contention. We're seeing the U.S. really coming back. We just had a Heritage report that put the U.S. military ranking at very weak in terms of the U.S. Navy. We just saw the Biden administration issue both a national security strategy, a national defense strategy that lists China really as the primary emerging threat for them in a potential, great conflict or great power conflict contest. So I think, we've been getting away with things for very little. We've had, most nations around the world haven't had to invest in their defense, particularly on their naval defense, because the U.S. has ensured the freedom of the seas. But now we're seeing that contested a little bit. And the challenge out there with the rise of China, with the rise of Russia once again, and more importantly, even regional threats out there we're seeing. There's always those disruptions that happen, whether it's the Ever Given in the Suez, whether it's the COVID policy on China. We're seeing those disruptions that keep throwing the supply chain into disarray. And we just haven't really gotten to clear, flat water yet after post-COVID.
JP, Taiwan, how big of that is a linchpin in all of this? I mean, obviously, it's a big stopping point between what the U.S. would like to see and what China would like to see.
Yeah, it really is. And I think, the Biden administration has been slowly moving toward a position of more clarity that, and sort of gradually increasing commitment to the preservation of Taiwan's independence. It's hard to know exactly what China's timetable is. Anthony Blinken, said at Stanford a few weeks ago that China plans on an accelerated timetable for reunification. But I always remember, anytime I start to get a little too paranoid or worked up, I remember how patient China was with regard to Hong Kong, mm-hmm. right, and sort of allowing that 99-year lease with the British to go through and sort of reintegrating that city, although there have been protests and civil disorder. There was no military confrontation. Yeah. So Taiwan as a sort of global center of semiconductor manufacturing, shipping, obviously, and other things, I think is very important, mm-hmm. and is. Now, I think what's hard to judge is how important it is internally to China. As we know in the U.S., a lot of our foreign policy initiatives and debates are actually driven by domestic policy disputes and factionalism. And I think the same is probably true in China. I just don't have as great a read on that and which powers are pushing for sort of more hawkish behavior on Taiwan and which powers are not.
Sal, where do you see this one going as far as Taiwan? I mean, how big of a linchpin is it right now?
I think John Paul hits a point there, and one of the things that we're seeing is really Taiwan and China is integrating economically much more than many people want to associate with. Most of the ships, for example, for Evergreen, one of the biggest container lines in the world, which is based in Taiwan, their ships are built in Chinese shipyards. They're serviced in Chinese shipyards. You literally have Taiwanese flag vessels going into China, something that most people don't see. If you look at what China is doing worldwide, ever since Chairman Xi came in and he initiated the Belt and Road Initiative, a lot of the Belt and Road is meant to provide redundancy in the import and export of Chinese goods. They don't want to be hemmed in like they were in the 1930s by Japan. They don't want to be cut off by a nation the way Japan was during World War II. And so what do? They build redundancy in. They build overland routes. They build railroads to Europe. They have multiple ocean routes in the Arctic, around the Drake Passage, South America, around Australia in case the South China Sea is blocked to them. They are always planning. The big joke is, we're playing checkers and they're playing, three-dimensional chess. And that's the way the Chinese think about a lot of things in terms of their imports and exports. China has a lot of problems, too. Let's be clear. Their growth is going down in terms of their GDP. They have an aging population. Their one-birth policy for a long time has left them in a very precarious position. And China, remember, imports as much as it exports. It needs those imports coming in to fuel itself, and it needs those exports to keep that economy going. So, if China finds himself in a desperate situation, which is the big problem, what do you do when Xi is in his 60s or 70s and has to present something? That's where you see desperation. We saw it with Putin in Ukraine, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, taking this to kind of the next step, and the last question I'll ask both of you here. If this relationship continues to hemorrhage or possibly even both sides decide to divest and go their separate ways, what's going to be the effect on shipping as far as American companies or manufacturing, and that coming from the east to the west? JP, is that going to be catastrophic, or can it be something we can manage?
I think, it sort of depends on how it happens, right? I mean, I can definitely see a world where the Trans-Pacific trade is more distributed with more origins and more destinations serviced by perhaps smaller vessels with faster, steaming faster and different kinds of service schedules. But, to your point, there's we actually talked about this in 2018, there's no quick replacement for China. You can't simply, build, millions of square feet of manufacturing capacity in, Vietnam, for example, and have that come online smoothly. Yeah. So, it will be disruptive. I think Sal was right to bring up the position of Japan in the 1930s prior to World War II. And this was a case where the sort of perceived need for security over food and rubber and petroleum and various other kinds of commodities precipitated aggressive action. I'm hoping that we can manage this relationship without boxing China into a position where they feel like that's their only option.
Sal, where do you think this could possibly end here? We've got about a minute or so in terms of if the two sides decide to go their different ways, what's going to be the effect?
Well, I think, trade has created a Faustian bargain between these countries. It's really hard for China to exist without this trade. Obviously, Europe is a big component of them, but America is absolutely essential for them. And, trade has opened it up. Again, I go back to this idea that, we've kind of leveled the playing field in the world. It's much flatter than it was post-World War II. Globalization is the norm. And even, when we started talking about reshoring and bringing commodities back and shifting production out of China to Vietnam, as John Paul mentioned, it's really tough to do because China has so much inroads already in it. And again, I go with that analogy that I used with Hong Kong. China's in it for the long game. Why invade Taiwan and disrupt trade with the entire world, their entire economy, when Taiwan is slowly falling within their sphere of influence economically, politically? I think they're in it for the long game. I think that we're pushing a confrontation that may not be. I think China's more worried about their neighbors, Japan, Korea, India, Vietnam. That's who they're worried about a lot more than us in some ways.
Well, it's definitely something that we could talk about for hours and hours and hours. But JP and Sal, thanks so much for joining us here. This has been an interesting conversation.
Thanks, Bill.
Thanks, Bill.
All right. More after this.